This project is grounded in the idea that fragmentation is not a loss, but a generative system. Drawing from Schlegel and Gachet, I explore how incomplete structures can produce meaning through relationships. Schlegel states that even the most complete system remains a fragment. This shifts our understanding of totality from something fixed to something that is always incomplete and open. This quote means that a system can never become complete or fully closed. Even when it appears coherent, it remains partial and limited. It always points towards something beyond itself that it cannot contain. In this sense, totality is never fully attainable, but only suggested through what is missing. Each fragment operates as a small system on its own. It is internally coherent and complete as a form, but it never contains the whole. It always remains open and connected to something beyond itself. The key shift is that system and fragment are no longer opposed. A system does not overcome fragmentation, it is a form of it. The whole is never given directly, but emerges through the relationships between fragments. In romantic thought, totality is no longer understood as something that can be fully constructed. Even the most coherent systems remain partial and incomplete. Fragmentation is therefore not a failure, but the condition through which the idea of the whole can appear. The whole is never directly present, it is only suggested. Gachet, building on Kant, explains that totality exists as an idea rather than as an object. It cannot be directly experienced. Each fragment points beyond itself, and meaning emerges through the relationships between fragments. The whole is therefore constructed relationally, not physically. Totality is not what fragments fail to be. It is what fragments alone make possible. By keeping the whole permanently in motion, permanently beyond reach, permanently generative. Therefore, every system inevitably leaves something outside its boundaries. In this sense, systems should not be understood as totalizing structures, but as fragments within a larger horizon of thought. In the A2 model, fragmentation is treated as an internal condition within a bounded system. The volume is not broken apart outwardly, but decomposed into discrete planes that remain relationally connected. The enclosure is suggested but never completed, so the whole is not reconstructed, it is instead activated through the relationships between fragments. The use of blue introduces a second layer of meaning. It creates a sense of depth and distance, suggesting a totality that can be approached but never fully attained. In this way, the model does not represent a complete object, but an open system where the whole is implied rather than constructed. The model fragments the volume into independent planes. The enclosure is no longer continuous, and the box becomes a dispersed condition rather than a closed object. The fragments do not connect physically, but through spatial relationships. Alignment suggests continuity, while displacements create interruption. The system operates as an open network, where the whole is suggested rather than constructed. These relationships produce specific spatial conditions such as separation, adjacency, and tension. Void becomes as important as solid, and space is defined by relationships rather than enclosure. Each plane operates as an autonomous fragment. These fragments do not depend on a complete whole but maintain their own internal logic. Their positioning creates a system of relations rather than a fixed structure through separation, displacement, and adjacency. The model is organized through relational conditions rather than fixed structure. Fragments interact through adjacency and distance, while misalignment creates spatial tension. The gaps between elements become active voids, and no single hierarchy dominates. The system remains open, and space emerges through relationships rather than objects. The box is not materially complete, but perceptually completed by the viewer. The fragments suggest an enclosure without ever closing it, creating an implied boundary. Following Gachet, totality is not constructed as an object, but exists as an idea emerging from these spatial relations. The model does not construct totality physically, instead it is purposely completed by the viewer. The fragments suggest an enclosure without ever closing it. The whole, therefore, exists as a mental projection that emerges from the relationships between elements. In this model, fragments are not opposed to the whole, but are the condition through which it appears. Totality does not exist as a fixed object, but emerges through relationships and tensions between fragments. The whole is therefore not constructed, but perceived. The specific spatial condition emerging from my A2 fragment configuration is an open, fragmentary system of spatial coherence, because each fragment operates as a microsystem while the overall structure remains incomplete and relational. I will now read you a paragraph of my chatting with chat. Movement through the site exposed interruptions in the circulation paths, particularly at congested intersections where spatial breaks dominate the flow. For example, in Radio Liban, the recording studios, isolated with controlled light and sound environments, contrast sharply with the fragmented urban fabric outside. For my group project, my classmates and I had to go to Radio Liban to get as much information as possible. We found out that Radio Liban has 2 French studios, 7 Arabic studios, and a special studio called Fayrouz Studio, where her greatest songs were recorded. Interestingly enough, Radio Liban holds one of the largest sound archives in the region, with around 22,000 music recordings and 45,000 radio programs. This archive faces degradation, and digitizing efforts often depend on international partners, grants, and ad hoc initiatives. The site can be understood as a fragmented field rather than a continuous system. The urban fabric is broken into distinct parts, where built and landscape elements remain disconnected. Gaps and voids separate these conditions, and no single structure organizes them into an undefined whole. The fragments of the site do not come from a continuous system, but relate through proximity, gaps, and thresholds. Circulation paths connect these fragmented zones, while misalignment creates tension. This site is therefore structured by relationship rather than continuity. These relationships generate specific spatial conditions such as separation, tension, and abrupt thresholds. Void spaces become active rather than residual, and movement through the sites produces a fragmented perception. Space is therefore not continuous, but defined by these relational conditions. The photomontage constructs meaning by rejecting a singular panoramic view of Sanaya, instead presenting it as a systemic rupture. On the left, the idealized microsystem represents a dream of modernist totality, orderly, grounded, and serene. On the right, this system suffers a structural breakdown. The ground plane dissolves and the architecture becomes a bungee tower of risk. The project interprets the site as a system of fragmentary structure rather than an undefined whole. Instead of proposing a closed building, it introduces a network of interventions that maintain relationships without resolving them into totality. This approach acknowledges ruptures while constructing an open system of spatial coherence. What I discovered about the site is that cultural institutions, public spaces, and everyday urban life coexist with neglect, interruption, and transformation. The site reveals a layered history. It is not read as a single continuous narrative story, but a collection of singular architectural presentations. These buildings are monuments of a system that was never fully completed for the whole city. Some areas remain active and inhabited, while others suspended, abandoned, or unresolved. The site therefore reveals itself as a place marked by temporal fragmentation, where different histories remain present but not fully connected into a unified system. The main spatial issue that emerged from the site is the disconnection between a highly defined central system and a fragmented surrounding urban fabric. The Sanaya Park operates as a closed and introverted spatial entity, organized through clear geometry and internal paths. However, this strong internal coherence contrasts sharply with the surrounding city, which is composed of irregular buildings, discontinuous spatial configurations, and fragmented circulation patterns. The site does not fail because it is fragmented, but because these fragments do not form a relational system. Each element operates independently, without contributing to a larger spatial coherence. The whole is therefore absent, not because it is incomplete, but because no structure exists to connect its parts. The architectural opportunity is to transform fragmentation into a relational system through movement. This is achieved by transforming edges into thresholds, activating voids, and reconstructing movement as a network. The goal is to create continuity without enclosure, where space is defined through relationships rather than objects. The site reveals a clear separation between man and nature. The park operates as a closed and isolated natural system, while the surrounding city is fragmented and disconnected. These edges function as barriers, and voids remain unused. As a result, man and nature coexist, but they do not interact. My position is not to insert nature into the city, or to isolate the park any further, but to create a continuous relational field between them. The Sanaya Garden currently operates as an isolated microsystem. The project redefines nature as an open system that extends beyond its boundaries and interacts with the urban fabric. The project also introduces porous thresholds that transform rigid edges into zones of interaction. Instead of separating the park from the city, fragmented planes, similar to the logic of the A2 model, mediate between the two. Paths and voids create continuity, not through enclosure, but through transitions and connections. The project transforms isolation into a relational system, where man and nature are no longer separated. Architecture is no longer conceived as an object, but as a network of relations. Fragmented elements connect through the interaction, creating a continuous spatial system. Climate is experienced as a gradient of exposure and refuge, where sun, wind, and humidity create zones of intensity rather than uniform conditions. Movement unfolds as a sequence of flows, interruptions, and decision points, where the site operates through thresholds rather than continuous circulation. The site is structured by a contrast between dense urban edges and the open void of the park, producing alternating conditions of enclosure and release. The site is perceived through shifting intensities of sound, openness, and comfort, forming a sequence of contrasting sensory conditions. The project therefore emerges as a response to these fragmented conditions rather than an imposed form. I propose a DJ-VJ booth on Radio Liban building in which fragmentation is used to construct an open and relational spatial system rather than a closed object. The proposal breaks the continuity of the site into a series of volumetric and planar fragments that operate as microsystems, positioned through distance, orientation, and alignment to generate relationships rather than enclosure. The intervals between fragments become active spaces of transition, pause, and interaction, functioning as passages, waiting zone, and visual corridors, shifting the space from a solid object to a relational void. Movement through the space creates a dynamic experience of compression and openness, tension and release, allowing the architecture to be understood through time and motion. Fragmentation here is not a sign of incompleteness. It is a generator of spatial continuity in which coherence emerges through relations between fragments rather than through a totalizing object. At this level, fragmentation shifts from an internal condition to an urban and architectural strategy. The project no longer operates as an isolated object, but as a field of relations distributed across the site. Spatial meaning emerges through intervals, alignment, and tensions between fragments rather than enclosure. The architect becomes a latent order organizing movement and perception across the site. The project is conceived as a dwelling, where inhabitation is distributed across a fragmented system, with make, rest, eat, and sleep emerging as overlapping conditions rather than enclosed rooms. The blue element represents a fragmented circulation system that connects the interior dwelling to the exterior. It operates as a continuous yet articulated sequence, linking fragments while maintaining openness. The upper platform can be accessed from both inside and outside, creating a dual access threshold between private and public conditions. Circulation here does not simply connect spaces but produces transitions between dwelling and performance. The project does not design a house, but a condition of dwelling emerging through fragmentation, where coherence is achieved through relationships rather than enclosure. This image shows the DJ-VJ dwelling booth as plug-in attached to the Radio Liban building. The intervention engages the facade through fragmented planes rather than forming a continuous volume. Gaps, overlaps, and projections create spatial relations, while the facade becomes a threshold between inside and outside. Circulation connects the dwelling to the exterior, making the building one fragment within a larger relational system.